Today I will be going over my historical theatrical performance Reconstruction on the Moscow Art Theater. Before we begin discussing the grand opening of the Moscow Art Theater, it is important to go over some of the historical context prior to its founding. We see in 1861, the Tsar Alexander II issues emancipation reform abolitioning serfdom and allowing 23 million serfs and peasants to purchase land along with other freedom rights. This painting by Boris Kostodiev depicts the peasant listening to the Emancipation Manifesto. This time would represent beginnings of promoting a self-government and freedom. In 1892, we see the Socialist Russian Revolution, which would be grounded in Marxism and sparked by the Industrial Age. Workers would protest and express their desire to receive fair treatment and end imperial rule with distinct classes. Then we move on to 1897, where the great Stanislavski and Tchaikovsky meet for the first time. Stanislavski being an actor from an early age with a passion for the actor's method, and Tchaikovsky being an artistic director. And together, in 1898, they founded the Moscow Art Theater, where they would show their first, or one of their first productions by Anton Chekhov called The Seagull. We move on to a quote from the book Modernism to Realism on the Soviet Stage by Nick Worrell, which says, up until 1898, there existed few, if any, professional theater companies in Russia capable of staging the serious new drama which was being produced within its own borders by Chekhov and Tolstoy. That deficiency was repaired with the establishment by Stanislavski and Nemirovich Donchenko of the Moscow Art Theater, as well as being a place of entertainment, was an institution of educational and moral concern. So we can see the beginnings of this Moscow Art Theater was rooted in not only being a source of entertainment, but also a place of education. We move on to our first question. What did the theater look like, and what would it have been like to attend a production in a theater from the past? If I draw your attention to the bottom left corner, we see a picture of inside the Moscow Art Theater, which was originally called the Leonozov Theater. Next to that, we see the ground plan of the Moscow Art Theater, displaying the orchestra, the auditorium, and many other elements that made this theater quite unique. As we notice, this is a proscenium arch and proscenium type theater. In order to get a ticket, it would involve going to the box office and joining a lottery to become eligible to attend a performance. Once a ticket was purchased, inside the Moscow Theater is where it got very, very interesting. One author named Oliver Sayler describes in his book, Inside the Moscow Art Theater, he describes what it would be like to be an audience member attending a show. He states that the process of purchasing a ticket would involve the lottery, but once that was won, he mentions how going inside there would be cloakrooms for what he called severe Russian winters. Then we'd move to the auditorium with 4 boxes, a balcony, and gallery with 1,200 seats with a great view and comfortable seating. Then we'd see, in the beginning, the foyer to accommodate an entire audience in between acts. And beneath the foyer was the box office, financial offices, the new museum, which displayed the trophies in theater's history. The 3 words he used to describe the interior design would be simplicity, severity, and the seagull. The seagull is definitely an important emblem, as Anton Chekhov's first featured play at the Mat was called The Seagull, and it became so popular that it became the official symbol on the theater that we can see in the last photo today. In addition to this, if you go further to the back, to behind the stage, there is a large stage with 3 platforms that can be lifted or dropped, a cyclorama, a double row of dressing rooms, men below the stage and women above the stage. So hopefully this gives you somewhat of a visual of how the theater looked inside and out. Who could perform in plays? There was a combination of amateur and professional actors that performed in the productions at the Moscow Art Theater. Some actors that were professional came from the Philharmonic Music and Drama School. We see Margarita Savitskaya. She was featured in the Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich play by Alexei Tolstoy. Next to that, we see Michael Chekhov, who is a nephew to Anton Chekhov. So some well-known actors and actresses. However, there was also amateur actors and actresses that were trained in dance, acting, and combat. But Stanislavski also believed that amateurs as well as professionals could go deeper into their characters. He was a strong believer in understanding human behavior from a psychological approach. He applied this psychological approach to acting in the performing arts. He went beyond drawing out the character to understanding the character's motivations, the secret desires of the character, and developing the character from inside out of the actor. The actor's job was to identify the super objective or the ultimate goal of the character, understand its given circumstances in order to emulate real life. Stanislavski allowed his actors to improvise, live in the moment, and allow for emotional spontaneity as if they were experiencing exactly what the character was experiencing, second by second. What plays and playwrights were popular? As we can see, among these faces are very famous playwrights. Monopolies were holding much of the control of the earlier imperial theaters. However, with Stanislavski's theater of the Mat, he was able to hire playwrights and showcase works that highlighted psychological realism, naturalism, and melodrama. We see with Shakespeare, they showcased Hamlet and Julius Caesar. With Leo Tolstoy, The Power of Darkness. We also see Nikolai Gogol and Maxim Gorky, The Lower Depths. It was officially renamed the theater, the Gorky Moscow Art Theater, in 1932. And all of these playwrights and their works contributed to the overall goal that Stanislavski wanted for the theater. Among the popular playwrights, we can't forget to mention one of the most notable and well-known playwrights in Russia, Anton Chekhov. Chekhov's father was a serf, and so he was very familiar with the social and historical context of Russia as it directly related to his life. He initially started out with writing The Seagull, which flopped, but was revived at the Mat Theater and made popular. Because it became so popular, we know it became the emblem of that theater. He also wrote Uncle Vanya, Three Sisters, and as we can see, a staging of a scene in the Cherry Orchard, which had many political messages about how the systems could change. And his stories were able to relate to people on a personal level, but also a political level. What class or classes of people went to the theater? Who attended to watch the plays? Why? What place did theater have in society? We know the significance of theater in society has always been to relay the messages of the author. But we know in the social context of Russia, there have always been issues between the classes and classism between the royal bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Looking back in history, Catherine the Great established the first theater in St. Petersburg in the 1700s. However, it was originally designed to cater to the upper class and their entertainment. But later, especially at the turn of the century when the Mat came about, it provided a proscenium space that allowed proletariat and bourgeoisie to sit together. which meant that they could both experience the realism and naturalism that was coming off the stage for them to both reflect on the current political issues and social issues that were going on at a macro level and a micro level. Was theater censored or banned? What we do know is that the theater was not banned. However, there were many cases of censorship. If we look at the first example, during the second tour of a play called Small People in 1902, Stanislavski and Nemirovich were faced with policemen who were trying to stop the performance. In order for the show to go on, they were forced to edit the play and even ask the police to change from their uniforms to dress attire in order to not frighten the audience. This is just one example, but it happened many times and continued into the 1930s when Stalin took power and enacted an artistic policy, among many artistic policies, which allowed him complete control over the content found in all Moscow theaters. He decided to focus attention on the Moscow Art Theater to represent his political ideals and agendas. We could see the negative effect of this as Stanislavski tries to negotiate with Stalin and tries to create content or plays that show realism but also reflect social realism. Eventually, Stanislavski cannot take the pressure of this and decides to instruct a protege named Meyerhold privately in his Stanislavski method. Unfortunately, after Meyerhold becomes his successor, he eventually is arrested, tortured, and shot by Stalin's totalitarian regime. So we see that censorship is has such a big influence on the many works that were produced at the time. Lastly, I just want to speak on liveness, how important liveness is to the theater, to the ephemeral experience. Back when the Moscow Art Theater began, Stanislavski had the goal of creating a space of reality, realism, and naturalism, things that the audience could relate to. Now, because he created more of a people's theater, it allowed both classes to see their lives reflected back at them on stage. They had access to seeing in a proscenium theater an excellent view from all angles, no matter if it was from the gallery or the box. And even though the focus might not have been on the costumes and the sets, the messages were very clear. And that is very similar to today. The purpose of theater is to help us to think, is to help us to see and reflect on what might be happening socially and politically in our lives today. And I think this example is just, was a catalyst to having theater become not only a live event, but to also be a relevant almost review to how life looks in the present moment. So I appreciate that about the Moscow Art Theater. I think it's an excellent example of how key liveness is, how important it is that everyone gather in a place to fully experience what these amazing playwrights had to offer their audiences.